To save her mother from ruin, a young woman named Isabella made a desperate bargain with the most feared creature in the realm, the reclusive, scarred Lycan King. The price was her innocence. The condition was an heir. But their cold transaction of flesh soon ignited a fire that would consume the very bargain that brought them together. Royal hearts. Find a quiet space and let yourself be swept away. For this story begins not in a palace, but in the shadows of a desperate choice. The water in the basin was tinged a faint, rusty brown. Isabella dipped the cloth again, the icy water stinging her chapped fingers. From the pallet on the floor, her mother coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of their crumbling cottage. "Shh, Mama," Isabella whispered, her voice hoarse from nights without sleep. "It's all right." The words were a lie, and they both knew it. The last of the firewood was gone. The last of the flour was a dusting at the bottom of the barrel. Her brother's hopeful, hungry face flashed in her mind. They were out of options. The knock on the door was not a request. It was a declaration. 3 heavy, uniform blows that made the frail wooden door shudder in its frame. Her heart leaped into her throat. She pulled a thin shawl over her mother, then walked to the door, her legs unsteady. She opened it to a man clad in the silver and onyx livery of the Lycan Royal Guard. His face was carved from stone. "Isabella?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "By order of King Theron, you are summoned to the Blackstone Keep, immediately." The world tilted. The Lycan King, the recluse, the crippled wolf. Stories of his coldness, his isolation, were legend. What could he possibly want with her? The journey to the keep was a blur of frozen landscapes and her own churning fear. The castle was a monstrous silhouette of jagged spires against a leaden sky, more a fortress than a home. Inside it was worse. It was a tomb. Silence echoed off the cold, dark stone. There were no tapestries, no fires in the vast hearths, no life. The throne room was cavernous and empty. And there, on a throne of obsidian, sat the king. Theron was not what she had expected. He was not a frothing beast. He was a statue of one. Immense, yes, with shoulders that spoke of latent power, but it was a power locked away. He was draped in shadows, his face all hard lines and angles, and on the left side, a tapestry of silvery scars that pulled at his eye and mouth. But it was his eyes that held her, a stormy haunted gray devoid of light. He watched her approach, his expression unchanging. He did not speak until she was standing directly before him, her worn shoes silent on the cold floor. "They tell me your family is starving." His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that vibrated in the vast space. It was not unkind. It was factual. "They tell me your mother is dying from a fever that simple medicine could cure." Isabella swallowed, forcing her chin to stay level. "Yes, Your Majesty. I have a proposition for you." He leaned forward slightly, the movement causing a shaft of pale light to fall across his scars. "A business arrangement. I require an heir. My line must continue. You require security." The heir left the room. Isabella's hands began to tremble. She clasped them tightly in front of her. "I am offering you a trade," he continued, his stormy eyes pinning her in place. "Your virginity, one night. If a child is conceived, your family will want for nothing, ever again. If not, the agreement is still fulfilled, and they will be provided for. You have my word." The words were so clinical, so brutally frank that they barely registered as the violation they were. They were simply facts. Cold, hard, desperate facts. She saw her mother's face, her brother's smile. A future without the gnawing fear in her belly. Tears she could not allow to fall burned behind her eyes. She took a shaky breath. "I accept," she whispered. A flicker of something, regret, pity, crossed his features before the mask of stone returned. He stood, a towering figure of shadow and sorrow. Then follow me. He led her from the throne room, down a winding corridor, to a bedchamber as austere as the rest of the castle. A large canopied bed dominated the room. He closed the door, the click of the lock final. He did not look at her. He walked to the mantel, his back to her. Disrobe. The command was soft, but it struck her like a physical blow. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the simple ties of her dress. The fabric, worn thin from years of use, pulled at her feet. Then her chemise. She stood in the center of the room, the cold air raising goosebumps on her bare skin, her arms crossed instinctively over her chest. She was utterly exposed. She heard him move. He crossed the room, a dark shape in the dim light. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint scent of pine and old leather. He was still fully clothed. He reached out, not to touch her, but to a candelabra on the bedside table. One by one he pinched out the flames, plunging the room into utter, absolute blackness. His voice came from the darkness, a raw whisper filled with a shame so profound it was almost tangible. "Do not look at me." She felt the bed dip as he joined her, feeling, a silent observer to this brutal exchange. He finished with a low, shuddering sigh that sounded less like pleasure and more like relief or exhaustion. He withdrew immediately. The mattress shifted as he left the bed. She heard the soft rustle of fabric as he dressed. Lying alone in the dark, the physical ache a dull throb between her legs, the first hot, silent tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her hairline. Then another. She did not make a sound. In the perfect blackness, the only thing she was aware of was the slow, cold spread of humiliation, and a piercing, unexpected sorrow for the broken king who could only claim his future in the dark. The darkness was no longer a shelter. It was a suffocating shroud, pressing down on her, heavy with the memory of what had transpired. Isabella lay frozen long after the door had clicked shut behind him, the echo of his departure more final than any lock. The scent of him, pine and leather and something uniquely, painfully him, lingered on the sheets, on her skin. A permanent brand. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the single high window, it felt like an accusation. It illuminated the room in all its stark, masculine austerity. It illuminated her, naked and sore, curled on the far side of the large bed. Moving felt like breaking a sacred silence, but the need to escape the scene of the crime was overwhelming. Her dress felt like a stranger's skin. Every rustle of the fabric was deafening. She slipped out of the room, a ghost in the hollow halls, and found the chamber she'd been given. The water in the pitcher was cold. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, but she could not scrub away the feeling of his hands, the phantom weight of his body, the chilling courtesy of his touch. A servant arrived later, wordlessly guiding her to a small, sunless breakfast room. He was already there, seated at the head of a table large enough for 20. He did not look up as she entered. The silence was a physical presence, thick and choking. The only sounds were the scrape of his knife against a plate and the frantic, deafening beat of her own heart. She took a seat as far from him as possible, her eyes fixed on her own empty plate. A servant placed food before her, eggs, smoked meat, warm bread. It was more food than she had seen in a month. It turned to ash in her mouth. She dared a glance at him. He was staring out a narrow window, his profile sharp and unyielding against the gray light. The scars on his face seemed deeper in the daytime, a map of past pain. He looked tired and profoundly alone. The king who had taken her in the dark now seemed like a man sitting vigil at his own funeral. The meal ended without a single word spoken. He stood and left without a backward glance. The relief was so potent it left her dizzy. This could not be her life. This gilded cage of silence and shame. She would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Driven by a desperate need for something, anything familiar, she found her way outside. The castle gardens were a graveyard. Hedges were overgrown into wild, tangled walls. Flower beds were choked with weeds. The earth was hard and barren. It mirrored the state of her soul. But unlike the castle stone, this was a desolation she understood. This she could fight. She found a rusted trowel and a pair of worn gloves in a shed. Without a plan, without hope, she simply began. She sank her hands into the cold, damp soil. She pulled at the stubborn weeds, the physical strain a welcome distraction from the ache in her heart. She worked until her muscles burned and her back protested, until the memory of the night before was pushed back by the immediate, simple needs of the earth. Day after day, she returned. A small, determined figure against the vast, neglected landscape. She did not see the figure in the high window of the west tower, standing in the shadows, watching. Theron told himself it was mere curiosity, a need to ensure his investment was not causing trouble. But his eyes were not drawn to the guards on patrol or the servants going about their duties. They were fixed on her. He watched the easy grace with which she moved, so different from the rigid march of his soldiers. He saw the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of soil on her cheek. He saw her pause sometimes, just to feel the weak sun on her face, her eyes closed. In his world of strategy, strength, and silence, she was a completely alien creature, a song he had forgotten how to hear. One afternoon, he found himself standing before an old iron-bound chest in his private chambers. Inside, buried beneath relics of a life before his injury, was a small velvet pouch. He weighed it in his palm for a long moment. The sun was warm on her back when she heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Isabella froze, her trowel halfway into the earth. It was him. King Theron stood a few feet away, his immense frame blocking the sun, casting her in his shadow. He was not looking at her face, but at the small, neat patch of earth she had cleared and planted with hardy winter seeds. He did not speak. The silence stretched, taut, and uncomfortable. Then, his hand, clad in fine leather, emerged from his cloak. He held out the small velvet pouch. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. It was the first word he had spoken to her since the command in the bedchamber. Hesitantly, she pulled off her glove and reached for it. Her fingers, small and dirt-stained, brushed against his. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She loosened the drawstring and poured a single seed into her palm. It was unlike any she had ever seen. Iridescent, like a captured moonbeam, and shaped like a teardrop. "It is a moon shadow bloom," he said, his gaze fixed on the seed in her hand, still avoiding her eyes. "They are fragile. The texts say they will only germinate for one who is—" He paused, searching for the right word, his jaw tight. "Patient. This one needs a gentle touch." The moonshadow seed rested in a small pot of specially prepared soil on her windowsill, a silent, shimmering secret between them. It was the first thread, fragile as a spider's silk, connecting their two solitary worlds. And it changed everything. The next day, he was there again in the garden, just as the sun began to warm the stones. He did not announce himself, simply stood at the edge of the path she was clearing, his hands clasped behind his back. "The soil here is too acidic for lavender," he said, his voice less a rumble and more a low, steady cadence. He gestured with his chin towards a patch of struggling plants. "It prefers limestone. There is a quarry on the northern border. I will have some crushed stone brought for you." It wasn't a command, it was information, offered freely. Isabella looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt less like a subject to a king and more like one gardener to another. That small exchange became a door, and he began to step through it. He started visiting the garden daily. At first, he only offered advice, his knowledge of botany deep and surprisingly tender. He spoke of pH balances and companion planting, his stormy eyes alight with a focus she had never seen in him. Then, one afternoon, as they knelt on opposite sides of a young, fragile sapling, their hands brushed as they both reached to steady its roots. The contact was electric. Isabella flinched back as if scalded. Theron went perfectly still, his gaze locked on where her skin had touched his. The air, once filled with the scent of damp earth, suddenly crackled. He did not apologize. He did not move. He simply looked, his gray eyes darkening with an emotion she couldn't name. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, charged, and terrifying. The conversation began to stray from the garden. He asked about her family, and she found herself telling him about her brother's foolish jokes, her mother's love for singing old ballads. In return, he spoke of his own childhood, not the royal training but the secret hours he'd spent in this very garden with his own mother, who had taught him the names of every flower. He spoke of history, of kings and battles, but also of poets and stargazers. She saw the man he might have been, before the scars, before the weight of a broken crown. He saw the woman she was, not a desperate peasant, but a person of resilience and quiet strength. A shared glance over a blooming rose held for a heartbeat too long, speaking volumes in the silence. It was on one such evening that the sky, which had been threatening all day, finally broke. The storm came not with warning, but with a vengeance. Rain lashed the castle walls, and wind howled like a banshee through the towers. They had been in the library, him showing her an ancient, illustrated text on celestial navigation, their shoulders a careful, deliberate inch apart. Then, a thunderclap detonated directly overhead. The very stones of the keep seemed to groan. Theron did not just startle. He shattered. He recoiled from the table as if struck, his chair screeching against the stone floor. A low, guttural sound was torn from his throat, pure, undiluted agony. His eyes were wide, unseeing, lost in some private battlefield. His hand went to his side, to the old injury beneath his clothes, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The king was gone. In his place was a soldier trapped in a nightmare. Isabella's own fear was swallowed by a surge of protective instinct so fierce it stole her breath. Without a thought for protocol, for the chasm between their stations, for the memory of the dark bedchamber, she moved. She crossed the space between them and reached for him. Her small, soil-stained hand closed over his. The large, scarred, trembling hand of the Lycan King. He flinched violently at her touch, his wild eyes snapping to hers. For a terrifying second, she thought she had made a fatal mistake. But then, he didn't pull away. He stared at their joined hands as if it were a miracle. The storm in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning, desperate wonder. The tension that had been building for weeks, the shared glances, the brush of hands, the whispered conversations, snapped. With a raw, broken sound, he moved. His free hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her to him, and his mouth found hers. This was nothing like the darkness. This was lightning and fire. The kiss was not gentle. It was a confession. It was a hunger. It was the dam breaking after a lifetime of isolation. His lips were desperate and demanding, tasting of storm air and a longing so deep it shook her to her core. She met Izzard. The library, once a tomb of forgotten knowledge, now felt like a sanctuary. The air itself was different, lighter, warmer, charged with the unspoken truth of what had passed between them. The scent of their passion lingered, mingling with the smell of old paper and rain-washed stone. In the days that followed, the entire castle seemed to breathe a sigh of relief it didn't know it had been holding. The servants, who had moved like ghosts, now offered Isabella small, tentative smiles. The halls felt less like a fortress and more like a home beginning to awaken from a long slumber. But the greatest change was in him. Theron began to smile. The first time it happened, it was so startling that Isabella nearly dropped the book she was holding. It was just a slight fleeting quirk at the corner of his mouth, a softening of the harsh lines around his eyes as he watched her struggle to pronounce an ancient elvish word. but it was a crack in the glacier, and the light that shone through was transformative. His smiles were rare, wondrous things, and she found herself cataloging each one, hoarding them like precious gems. He sought her out, not just in the garden, but everywhere. He would find her reading in a sunlit alcove and sit with her in comfortable silence. He would ask her opinion on matters of the court, truly listening to her answers. Their conversations were no longer just about plants and history, but about hopes and fears, and the quiet, silly details of a shared life. The air between them hummed with a tenderness so profound, it sometimes stole her breath. This was the fragile new reality when the visitor arrived. The sound of cheerful, unfamiliar voices in the courtyard was a jarring intrusion. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat when a guard announced her brother, Lucas. He burst into the great hall, his face flushed with health and excitement, his arms laden with simple gifts from home, a woven blanket, a jar of honey. He looked prosperous. His clothes were new, his boots sturdy. The gnawing hunger was gone from his eyes. "Isa!" he cried, sweeping her into a crushing hug. Then his eyes landed on King Theron, who had entered silently behind her. Lucas's demeanor shifted instantly. The familiarity vanished, replaced by a posture of deep, groveling reverence. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head so low his forehead nearly touched the stone floor. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling with awe. "Our Savior, our family is forever in your debt. The medicine, the food, the new roof, we owe you everything." Isabella watched Theron's face. The soft light in his gray eyes extinguished. The gentle line of his mouth hardened into the familiar, severe mask. He looked at Lucas's bowed head, then his gaze flickered to Isabella, and in that fleeting moment she saw it. A flicker of profound shame. "You are welcome here," Theron said, his voice the cool, impersonal rumble of the king she had first met. "Your sister has been adequate." The word was a carefully placed dagger. Adequate. It reduced the library, the shared smiles, the whispered secrets back to a transaction. Lucas, beaming, seemed to find it a grand compliment. Later, as Lucas was shown to his guest chamber, he pulled Isabella aside, his expression turning serious. "Isa, listen," he whispered, his eyes wide with earnest concern. "You see how he is? A king, a man of his word. But you must be careful. Do nothing to displease him. Remember the contract, our family's future. It all depends on you keeping his favor." He squeezed her arm, a well-meaning jailer locking her back in her cage. "Do not forget what you are here for." His words landed like a physical blow. What you are here for. The cold, clinical agreement, the dark room, the tears and the silence. That evening, a formal, stilted dinner was held. Lucas spent the meal regaling Theron with elaborate praises, each "Your Majesty" and generous benefactor, making Theron withdraw further into himself. He answered in monosyllables, his knuckles white around his goblet. The next morning, they stood in the courtyard to see Lucas off. He bowed repeatedly, his gratitude a cringing, painful display. As his cart rumbled out of the gate, the heavy silence returned, but now it was filled with the ghosts of their past. Theron stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the distant road. The morning sun illuminated the scars on his face, making them look deeper, more painful. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of all emotion, and it shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces. "You should go with him," he said, not looking at her. "See your family. You are not a prisoner here." He was giving her an out. Pushing her away before the world he thought she truly wanted, a world without him, could tempt her back. He was the king, the monster who had bought her, and he was offering her her freedom, terrified that she would take it. The words hung in the cold morning air, sharp and final as a headsman's axe. "You are not a prisoner here." He did not wait for her reply. King Theron turned on his heel, his cloak sweeping behind him, and strode back into the dark mouth of the keep, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard. The distance he created was a physical chasm, and she felt the chill of it seep into her bones. Every instinct born of a life of obedience screamed at her to flee, to run after the fading dust of her brother's cart, back to a simple, uncomplicated life, back to being a daughter, a sister, not a purchased bride tangled in a king's tortured soul. But her feet remained rooted to the spot. She saw not the cold, scarred king, but the man who had whispered the names of stars to her, the man whose hands, though scarred, were so gentle with a fragile sapling, the man who had shattered in the library and looked at her as if she were his only anchor in a storm. Lucas saw a benefactor. Isabella saw a man. Her man. She found him in the West Tower, in the small circular room that held his mother's old telescope. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders a rigid line of tension, braced for the sound of her retreating footsteps, for the silence he believed was his due. Theron. His name was a soft breath on her lips. He flinched as if she'd struck him, but he did not turn. She walked into the room, the hem of her dress whispering against the stone. My brother sees a king, a savior, a story. She stopped behind him, close enough to feel the heat of his body, but not yet touching. But I am not my brother. She reached out and laid her hand flat against the tense muscles of his back, right between his shoulder blades. He shuddered violently under her touch. My place, she said, her voice clear and steady, is here. It was the key that unlocked him. He turned, and the raw, unguarded agony in his eyes stole the air from her lungs. The king was utterly gone. Before her was just a man, laid bare. Isabella, he choked out, his voice breaking. I cannot live with this bargain, this transaction. The word was a curse. Every time I look at you, I see what I took from you. I see the darkness. I feel like a monster who bought the one thing that should never be sold. His hand came up, gesturing vaguely between them at the invisible chains of their contract. It is void. From this moment it is void. You are free. The gold, the land, it is your family's, it is yours. But you are free to go. He took a ragged breath, his stormy eyes swimming with a vulnerability that shook her to her core. But I am begging you, he whispered, the confession torn from the deepest, most broken part of him. Do not go. Stay. Not because of a contract. Stay. For me. I love you. The silence in the tower was absolute, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. The three words hung between them, fragile and magnificent, dissolving the last remnants of the deal that had brought her here. Isabella did not answer with words. Words were too small, too easily misunderstood. She took his hand, his large, scarred, trembling hand, and she led him from the tower. She led him through the silent corridors, past the staring portraits of his ancestors, her steps sure and steady. She did not lead him to his cold, austere chamber, but to her own. The room where the moonshadow seed sat on the windowsill, where the morning sun streamed in golden and warm. She stopped in the center of the room, still holding his hand, and turned to face him. The light fell fully upon them both, leaving no shadow, no corner to hide in. Then love me, she said softly. Not the king. The man. Her fingers went to the fastenings of her own dress. And let me love you. This time she undressed herself, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. She let the fabric pool at her feet until she stood before him, bathed in sunlight, utterly exposed and completely unafraid. Then she stepped forward. Her hands went to the clasp of his cloak, then to the buttons of his tunic. He stood frozen, his breath catching, allowing her to undress him. With each piece of clothing that fell, she saw more of the map of his pain, the silvery scars on his chest, the terrible knotted wound on his side that had stolen his wolf, the smaller nicks and marks of a lifetime of battle. When he stood as bare as she did not flinch. She did not look away in pity. She reached out and traced the worst of the scars, the one on his side, with her fingertips. "Show me," she whispered. Afterward, they lay entwined in the sunlit room, limbs tangled, hearts beating in a slow, synchronized rhythm. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, his face buried in her hair. His body relaxed for the first time since she had known him. The contract was ash. The bargain was over. All that remained was the truth they had built in its place. The world had been remade in gold and warmth. In the sun-drenched days that followed, the Blackstone Keep was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary. Laughter echoed in the halls, not as a foreign intrusion, but as its new, rightful music. Isabella's presence was in every room. A vase of wildflowers on a stark mantelpiece, a forgotten book left open on a windowsill, the gentle hum of a ballad she sang while tending her garden. And Theron. Theron was a man reborn. The rigid tension that had held him captive for years had melted away. He smiled freely now, a true, unguarded smile that transformed his scarred face into something heartbreakingly handsome. He walked with a lighter step, his shoulders no longer bowed under the weight of a broken crown, but squared with a new, quiet confidence. But the most profound change was one felt more than seen. A low, contented thrum of energy began to radiate from him, a warmth that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the twilight garden, a rabbit startled from the bushes. In a flash, a low, guttural growl rumbled in Theron's chest, a sound not of human annoyance but of primal instinct. It was a sound that had been silent for a decade. He stopped dead, his eyes wide with shock. Isabella squeezed his hand. "Did you?" she whispered, her heart soaring. He looked down at his own chest as if seeing it for the first time. "I felt it," he breathed, wonder in his voice. "My wolf. It stirred. It's not gone." A tear traced a path through his beard. It was the first flicker of embers in a hearth long thought cold. This was the blissful world they inhabited when the shadow arrived. His name was Lord Valerius, a Lycan noble from a powerful, ancient bloodline. He arrived with a retinue of grim-faced warriors, his demeanor as polished and cold as the silver inlay on his armor. When he was presented in the throne room, his eyes, a pale, calculating blue, swept over Theron, and a faint, dismissive smirk touched his lips. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, his voice slick as oil. He gave a bow that was just a hair too shallow to be respectful. "The court buzzes with tales of your improved spirits, and this must be the human." His gaze shifted to Isabella, standing beside the throne, and it was a physical violation, stripping her down to her mere biology. "How quaint." Theron's hand tightened on the arm of his throne, the wood groaning in protest. The warm hum of his wolf vanished, replaced by a cold silence. "You will address her as my queen," Theron said, his voice dangerously low. "Of course," Valerius purred, his eyes glinting. "My apologies. It is only that for the stability of the realm, some of us had hoped for a union that would, strengthen the royal bloodline. A bond that would remind our people of the strength of the Lycan, not its dilution." His eyes flickered pointedly to Theron's side, where the old injury lay hidden beneath his clothes. "And to see our king so recovered is a blessing. Truly." The words were poison, expertly delivered. Each one was a needle pricking at Theron's deepest insecurities, his injury, his perceived weakness, his choice of a human mate. The man who had laughed in the sunlight that morning retreated, and the shadow of the king returned. That evening he was distant at dinner, his answers to Isabella's questions short, his gaze fixed on some distant, grim horizon. When she reached for his hand, he pulled it away under the pretext of reaching for his wine. "Theron, what is it?" she asked, her heart aching. "It is nothing for you to concern yourself with," he said, his voice the cool, formal tone he used with his counsel. "The politics of wolves are complicated. I will not have you burdened by them." He was building a wall stone by stone, trying to protect her from the ugliness of his world. But in doing so, he was shutting her out. The warmth of their chambers that night was stifled by the chill of his silence. He held her, but his mind was miles away, battling ghosts she could not see. The confrontation came to a head the next day in the council chamber. Valerius, with the support of several other traditionalist nobles, stood before Theron. "The kingdom grows restless, Your Majesty," Valerius declared, his voice carrying through the hall. "They see a king who has not fully manifested his wolf in a decade. They see a human by his side, a queen who cannot bear the true mate bond of our people. How can a king who is not whole rule a kingdom of Lycans?" Theron rose, his fury a cold, contained storm. "You overstep, Valerius." "I speak for the strength of our people," Valerius shot back, his eyes blazing. "You have not proven your strength since your injury. You hide behind your walls with your human consort. The throne cannot be held by a cripple and a barren bond." The insult to Isabella was the final spark. "You will hold your tongue," Theron snarled, the first real growl anyone had heard from him in years tearing from his throat. "Or what?" Valerius sneered. "You will lecture me? I challenge you, Theron. I challenge your right to rule. By the ancient laws of our people, the trial by combat. Let the moon goddess decide if you are still worthy of the crown." A dead silence fell over the room. The trial by combat was not a duel. It was a fight to the death, a brutal, primal test of sheer power and will. Theron's face was pale, but his eyes were fierce. He knew he had no choice. To refuse was to forfeit the throne. "I accept," he said, his voice echoing in the terrible silence. As the council filed out, a triumphant Valerius at their head, Theron finally looked at Isabella. All the walls were down. In his eyes she saw not the king but the man, terrified not for his life but for the future he had just built with her. The old wound on his side seemed to pulse, a phantom ache of past failures. The trial was set for the next full moon. The full moon was a cold, merciless eye in the sky, bleaching the world of color and filling it with sharp black shadows. The ancient fighting arena, a circle of worn stone nestled within the castle grounds, felt like the center of the universe. The air was thick with the scent of nervous wolves and cold iron. Isabella stood in the royal box, her hands clenched so tightly on the stone railing that her knuckles were white. She could not breathe. Below, in the center of the arena, stood Theron. He wore only simple fighting leathers, and even from this distance, she could see the tension in his body, the slight, almost imperceptible favor he gave to his injured side. He was in pain. The old wound, a constant companion for a decade, was a live wire of agony in the cold night air. Across from him, Lord Valerius looked like a predator, born for this moment. He was larger, fueled by vile ambition, and he moved with a fluid, cruel confidence. He cast a dismissive glance toward Isabella, a silent reminder of everything he believed made Theron weak. A single horn blast shattered the silence. The fight was not a duel. It was a savage ballet of teeth and claw. Valerius shifted first, his form exploding into a massive silver-furred wolf, all rippling muscle and fury. Theron met him, his own shift a fraction slower, a testament to his body's reluctance. His wolf was a dark, storm-gray beast, its form powerful but hesitant. The ghost of the injury was there, in the slight hitch of its shoulder, the way it favored a front leg. Valerius exploited it without mercy. He was a whirlwind of snapping jaws and raking claws, each attack aimed not to kill immediately, but to weaken, to taunt, to reopen old wounds. He drove Theron back again and again, his attacks brutal and efficient. A deep gash opened on Theron's flank, staining his gray fur with crimson. Another blow landed directly on his scarred side, and a pained yelp was torn from him, a sound that lanced through Isabella's heart. She watched, helpless, as the love of her life was systematically broken. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the sunlit garden was being crushed under the weight of fang and claw. Theron fought with the desperate courage of a cornered animal, but Valerius was stronger, faster, and utterly without mercy. The end came swiftly. Valerius feigned a lunge, then twisted with impossible speed, his powerful jaws closing around Theron's injured shoulder. With a brutal shake, he lifted the gray wolf and slammed him onto the stone floor. Theron lay there panting, struggling to rise, his body broken. Valerius stood over him, victorious, saliva dripping from his maw onto Theron's neck. He lifted his head to the moon, ready to howl his triumph before delivering the final killing bite. "No!" The cry was ripped from Isabella's soul. It was not a word, but a raw, primal sound of pure, undiluted love. It echoed across the silent arena, a force unto itself. Theron. At the sound of his name on her lips, his body jerked. Valerius hesitated, turning his head in contemptuous surprise. And in that split second, everything changed. A surge of power, golden and incandescent, erupted from the center of Theron's being. It was not the power of the wolf, but the power of the man, of a love that refused to let him fall. His pain, his fear, his decade of isolation, all of it was burned away in that single blinding moment. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the arena, he surged upward. His form seemed to grow, to become denser, more real. His muscles coiled with renewed, impossible strength. He moved faster than sight, his own jaws locking around Valerius's exposed throat. There was a sickening crack, a final gurgling whimper, and then silence. It was over. Theron stood over the lifeless form of his rival, his massive chest heaving. The arena was utterly silent, every wolf holding its breath. Then he shifted, not back to the man, but to his full Lycan form, a towering, majestic blend of man and wolf, a form of pure, untamed power that had been lost to him for 10 long years. He threw back his head, and a deep, resonant, powerful growl rumbled from his chest. It was the voice of his wolf, not a flicker or a whisper, but a clear, thunderous declaration. It was the sound of a king restored, a soul made whole. He was whole. His fierce golden eyes swept across the stunned crowd, past the kneeling warriors, and found hers. In their depths was not triumph, not vengeance, but a love so vast it dwarfed the moon itself. That night there was no celebration in the great hall. The only feast was in the privacy of their chambers. He did not kiss her gently. He backed her against the door the moment it closed, his body pressed against hers. A living wall of heat and power and barely leashed wildness. The scent of battle and blood still clung to him, mixed with the intoxicating primal aroma of his fully awakened wolf. "Mine," he growled against her lips, his voice a low, possessive rumble that vibrated through her very bones. This was not the tender lover of the sunlit room. This was the Lycan King, claiming his queen. His hands were not reverent. They were demanding, stripped. After, as they lay tangled in the wreckage of sheets and passion, the moon casting its silver light upon them, he held her so tightly she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. The low, contented growl still hummed in his chest, a constant, comforting vibration. He was whole, and in his arms, so was she. The low, contented growl that had rumbled in Theron's chest through the night was more than a sound. It was the new foundation of their world. In the days that followed, the change in him was absolute. The Lycan King was no longer a story of past glory and present pain. He was a living force. His power, once locked away behind a wall of agony, now radiated from him, a steady, confident energy that commanded not just obedience, but awe. The court, which had once watched him with pity or doubt, now looked upon him with unwavering loyalty. And they looked at Isabella with a new reverence. She was no longer the purchased bride or the human consort. She was the queen who had healed their king, whose love had been the catalyst for his restoration. She saw it in their bowed heads, in the way they now called her, Your Grace, with genuine respect. She had everything she had never dared to dream of: safety for her family, a kingdom's respect, and the fierce, devoted love of a king reborn. Yet, in the quiet moments, a strange loneliness began to bloom in her heart. It was a hollow ache that Theron's love, for all its power, could not entirely fill. She missed the simple, chaotic warmth of her family's cottage, the sound of her brother's laugh, the feel of her mother's hand on her brow. The rigid formalities of court life felt like a beautifully embroidered straitjacket. She was the center of a glorious world, but she was, in some ways, more isolated than ever. Then another change began, this one deep within her own body. It started with a profound weariness that sleep could not touch. Then a sudden violent aversion to the smell of the strong morning tea she usually loved. One afternoon, standing in her sunlit garden, the world swam before her eyes, and she had to grasp a stone bench for support, her breakfast rising in her throat. The truth, terrifying and magnificent, dawned on her with the force of a physical blow. She was with child, the heir, the fulfillment of the cold, clinical contract that had brought her here. A joy so sharp it was almost painful surged through her, followed immediately by a cold, clutching fear. She thought of the physical ordeal, the vulnerability, the sheer terrifying responsibility of bringing a new life, a future king or queen, into the world. But the deepest fear was one she could not voice. Would this child, conceived first in a transaction and later in love, be seen as the former or the latter? Would the court, would Theron, see it as the final payment on a debt, the secured bloodline? Or would they see it as what it was? A child born of the library's passion, the garden's tenderness, the triumphant love that had roared back to life in the arena. She waited for a perfect moment, her secret a heavy, precious weight in her heart. She found it one evening as they stood on their balcony, watching the sun set over the mountains, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. "Theron," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He murmured, his lips against her hair. She turned in his arms, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took his large, scarred hands and placed them gently, reverently on her still flat stomach. She looked up into his eyes, her own filled with a mixture of hope and terror. "The contract," she began, her voice trembling. "It is fulfilled." For a moment, he didn't understand. His brow furrowed in confusion. Then, as the meaning of her words, of the placement of his hands, crashed over him, his entire world seemed to stop. The powerful, confident king vanished. The air left his lungs in a sharp, stunned gasp. His eyes, locked on hers, widened, the stormy gray shimmering with a sudden welling moisture. His jaw went slack. A single ragged sob broke from him, then another. He did not cheer. He did not speak of dynasties or bloodlines. He crumbled. His legs gave way and he sank to his knees before her, his great shoulders shaking. He buried his face against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her hips, holding her as if she were the most fragile, most sacred thing in all the world. His tears, hot and unchecked, soaked through the thin fabric of her dress. "Isabella," he choked out, his voice thick with a weeping, joyous awe. "My love. My heart." He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his expression one of such pure, unadulterated love and reverence that it swept every one of her fears away. This was not the reaction of a king securing his legacy. This was the overwhelming, tearful joy of a father, a man humbled by the miracle of a love that had given him back his life, and was now giving him a future. His tears were a baptism, washing away the last remnants of the contract, sealing their future in a bond more profound than any law or crown. For a handful of sun-drenched days, the world was perfect. Theron's joy was a tangible force, his hands constantly seeking her, resting on the gentle, nascent curve of her belly as if to assure himself the miracle was real. He looked at her as if she had hung the moon and stars solely for his pleasure. But soon, that awe curdled into a smothering fear. He became a shadow, a constant looming presence. If she walked in the garden, 2 guards became 6. If she felt a slight dizziness, he would summon the court physician in a panic. He forbade her from riding, from walking the outer walls, from even lifting a heavy book. The fierce Lycan King who had faced down a challenger without flinch was now terrified of a stray breeze. "Theron, I am with child, not made of glass," she pleaded one afternoon after he had gently but firmly taken a basket of cuttings from her hands. "You do not understand," he said, his voice tight, his eyes dark with a remembered pain she could not know. "The world is full of threats. I will not lose you. I will not lose either of you." The words were meant to be loving, but they felt like chains. The argument that followed was small, sparked by his refusal to let her visit a village festival, but it was fueled by her simmering frustration and the volatile storm of her hormones. "I am your wife, not your prisoner," she finally cried, her voice breaking. "I cannot live in a cage, even one built of love." "It is not a cage, it is protection," he roared back, his own fear making him harsh. "Must I remind you of the dangers, of Valerius? There are still those who would see me fall by harming you." They stood in stony silence, the chasm between them feeling vast and cold. He saw only the vulnerability of the woman carrying his child. She felt the erasure of her own strength, the person she had been, the one who had saved her family, who had healed a king's garden and his heart. It was in this fraught silence that the new threat struck. It happened in the inner courtyard, a place Theron had deemed safe. Isabella was walking with her young, timid lady-in-waiting, Ilara, discussing the patterns for a nursery quilt. The attack was not a frontal assault but a viper's strike. 2 men, their faces hidden, lunged from a shadowed archway. Not for Theron. He was too well guarded, too powerful. Their daggers, coated with a substance that smelled of bitter almonds, were aimed directly at Isabella's heart. Theron's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. A roar that was pure, undilated fury shook the courtyard. He moved in a blur, no longer a man, but an avalanche of retribution. He did not simply disarm the attackers, he dismantled them. The sound of breaking bone and tearing flesh was sickening, a brutal symphony of a king's wrath. In seconds, the 2 men were lifeless on the stones, but in his single-minded focus on the primary threat, he missed the third. A crossbowman, hidden high in the battlements, loosed a bolt. It was not aimed at the king, nor at the queen. It was aimed at the fleeing, terrified Ilara, a silent, cruel message. Isabella saw it. She saw the glint of the bolt, the trajectory. There was no time to scream, no time to think. She didn't throw herself in front of it. Instead, in a moment of stunning clarity, she grabbed a large, polished silver platter from a nearby serving table. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hurled it like a discus, not at the bolt, but at the ground directly in front of Ilara. The platter clattered and spun, a blinding, distracting flash of light and sound. The crossbowman, startled, jerked his aim. The bolt meant for Ilara's heart sank into the earth a hand's breadth from her foot, quivering. The courtyard fell silent again, the only sound Ilara's ragged sobs of relief. Theron stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his hands dripping with the blood of his enemies. His eyes found Isabella. They were no longer filled with the fear of a protector, but with the stunned awe of a man witnessing a miracle. She had not fought with tooth and claw. She had fought with her mind, with her heart, with a clever, quick-thinking courage that had saved a life he had not even seen was in danger. The aftermath was quiet. The bodies were cleared, the guards reprimanded, the security doubled. But the real reckoning happened in their chambers. He came to her, his immense power now folded into a posture of humility. He did not reach for her. "I was wrong," he said, his voice raw. "I saw only the woman I needed to protect. I forgot the queen who is strong enough to protect others. I did not trust your strength. and I am sorry." Isabella felt her own anger dissolve. She saw the terror in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. The all-consuming fear of a man who had just gotten everything back, only to be shown how easily it could be shattered. "And I am sorry," she whispered, stepping forward to take his blood-stained hands in her clean ones. "I did not understand the depth of your fear. I only felt smothered. I will be more careful. But you must trust me, Theron. You must trust the woman you love." He pulled her into his arms then, a broken, grateful sound escaping him. The reconciliation was a physical ache, a melting of the cold distance that had grown between them. That lovemaking was a world away from the fierce claiming after the trial. It was a slow, tender exploration, a physical apology, and a reaffirmation. He worshipped her body, his hands and lips tracing the gentle swell of her belly, with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. There was a new, profound sweetness to his touch, a protective, awestruck gentleness that celebrated the life growing within her. "I love you," he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "My clever, brave, magnificent queen,